over there. World War II was a major event in the world's history. But why? The Second World War was fought from the 1st of September 1939 to the 2nd of September 1945, considered to be the deadliest war in the history of the world, notorious for its whopping number of casualties, killed people, army men from various countries. It was basically fought between two power holders, Axis and Allied. So, Axis was consisting of the Nazi Germany, the Fascist Italy, and the Imperial Japan, as well as some smaller allies belonging to Europe. Whereas the Allied consisted of the Britain, the Commonwealth nations of Britain, USA, and USSR. Both were equally stronger lots. The Axis nations were defeated and the era of European colonialism ended. So, this is something which ended at the end of the Second World War. The reasons for beginning of the Second World War were largely unknown. The first version was they attributed to the continuation of the First World War. Second was that there was an event that happened when Japan seized a region of China by the name of Manchuria in the year 1931, which led to dispute between both the countries. But it is still unknown, it is still disputed. These changes resulted in many changes like social change, political change, economical change on the literary front. Commencement of a Cold War between USA and USSR started. And despite the massive loss of lives and wealth, technological development is something which is noted during this era, during the Second World War. Now, something that is largely ignored, or rather not known by the people, is India's contribution to the Second World War. India stayed in the shadow of British, reason being that India was ruled by the British. So it was known as the British India, and the army was considered to be the British Indian Army. It was within the mighty figure of British Regiment. Their role in enabling the Britain win over the Axis nations has been forgotten, which is why I use the word unsung heroes. It is held that India had no real role to play in the world wars as they were fighting for the freedom of their own land. Somebody that is fighting for their own land for freedom from the British, how can they contribute towards fighting the world war? It's a world war. But history has proved it wrong. There are facts present which says and which prove that India played an inevitable role in the Second World War, at least from the point of view of British, to push people out of this country. On one side, Indians were fighting frantically for freedom, their own country's freedom, which was their own battle. This can be considered to be an internal battle. And the second was a large portion of Indian army fought for the British in the Second World War. This was the external battle. There were many regiments contesting the war, and I will discuss those regiments in the coming slides. One being the 14th Army, which is a multinational force of British consisting of Indian soldiers, Indian and African units, turned the tide in Asia by recapturing Burma for the Allies. So, Indian army was fighting for some other country, prominently its neighbor, to make sure that the neighbors are safe and they are not taken over by the Japanese army. It was Japanese army that attacked Burma. Facts that prove Indian Army's involvement and contribution during the Second World War. In 1939, the British Indian Army had almost 205,000 men, which grew to almost 2.5 million, which is close to 25 lakhs after 1945. So it kept on increasing by the day because in this regime from 1939 till 1945, they were constantly increasing because of increased workforce and manforce required in order to contest the Second World War. British Indian Army was a conglomeration of tank, artillery, and airborne forces. So the names of these forces were separate, and we were fighting from every single source, whether it was through air, whether it was through land, or even water. The amphibious forces were also prevalent at that point in time. Indians fought magnanimously on several fronts, like European theatre against Germany, North Africa against Germany and Italy, South Asian region defending India against the Japanese. So they fought against the Japanese over here, prominent fight, and fighting the Japanese in Burma. Again, a prominent fight to free Burma and to make its neighbor safe. So Indians have fought on many fronts just to make sure that their contribution towards their own country, as well as to their own people, as well as to their neighbors, is immense. India supplied its financial resources to maintain the supplies to the army, which was its own army, industrial resources to make sure that enough equipment and artillery is supplied, and manpower to the British army. The Muslim League was supporting the British war front, but the INC called for a Quit India movement, demanding that they would not accede to British until the freedom was granted. So this was the internal war. The leaders were arrested and jailed eventually. But during this time, where was the army? It was basically fighting a war. The basic question arises, why? What prompted Indians to take part in the Second World War? Why couldn't they just stick to their own war, their own internal war? So, the very first reason is for the daily bread and livelihood. The daily bread and livelihood, they wanted this, they wanted access to this, which could have only been gotten if they were listening to what the British said. So, that is considered to be living in captivity and being harassed by an external ruler. Some people hoped that British would give freedom soon after the Second World War, which was true. It was basically true. So British had promised a dominion status after the war. And the third was India under British rule had no other option but to abide by the instruction of its rulers. This was a prominent option. So first and third were prominent options, and second option was a hope that arose in the minds of people. This prompted Indians to take part in the war. The Southeast Asian theatre was again a type of war that was fought in the Southeast Asian region of Burma. British Indian Army was in the forefront of warding off Japanese troops from Burma. Burma was tried to be annexed by Japan. Rather, it was annexed by Japan. When Japan advanced its approach to interior parts of India, there was no other way to fight back, but the Indian army could have had a face off with the Japanese troops. So, what were the name of the troops at that point in time? Indian 3 Corps, Indian 4 Corps, the Indian 23 Corps, and the 14th Army. They constituted the British Indian Army that fought against Japan, fighting relentlessly against Japan. Japan advanced into South Asia, specifically Southeast Asian Asia, reaching to Kohima in Nagaland. Kohima is Nagaland's capital. Their attempts to annex Nagaland and the northeastern frontier province of India failed twice. Battle of Kohima in June, Battle of Imphal in July. Both of them failed and India won. India not only prevented Japan from annexing its territories, but also proved instrumental in earning British astounding victory over Japan, which was considered to be a huge development of India. Indian Army. So these are some pictures of Indian Army of that point in time. Now comes the Burmese angle, the bloody hell angle. Bloody hell. So Burma, also known as Myanmar, was occupied by Japan in 1942. Japan invaded Burma in the pretext of emancipating them from the British. So false promises that we would free you from the captivity held by the British. But as history holds it, they declared Burma as independent by forming the state of Burma on August 1943. It is good. Burma soon realized its folly or its mistake when Japan gradually began to assert its influence in the region. To drive out the Japanese, they sought help from the British. So now Japanese were ruling them and the British had left them because of Japan's invasion. So British China and USA came forward to help Burma and defeat Japan. British provided its Indian Army. Here comes the role of Indian Army, the 14th Army to safeguard Burma. The names of the operations that were held. The one was Operation Dracula, Battle of Elephant Point, and Battle of Setang Bend. So one of these was the road battle, second was the amphibious battle, and the third was the airborne battle that was fought. It enfeebled, it made Japan weak. The presence of Japanese troops in Burma became weak because of presence of British Indian Army. Indian Army proved too strong for Japan and they withdrew their presence by 1945. They moved away from Burma by 1945. Now, what was Subhash Chandra Bose's role in World War II? Bose reprimanded British for their double standards approach vis-à-vis the Indian soldiers and the Indians, looking at their approach in fighting Nazism and fascism as they were doing the same in India. So they were playing a two-sided game. Broke away from Congress, left India, and vowed to fight with Japan and Germany in fighting the British Raj, which means that technically he was fighting against the ruled India. So the Indian National Army (INA), formed first by Mohan Singh Deb, consisting initially of prisoners taken by the Japanese in Malaya and at Singapore, who were offered the choice of serving the INA by Japan or remaining in very negative conditions in prisoners of war. Later, after it was reorganized under Subhash Chandra Bose, it drew civilian volunteers from Malaya and Burma. So here there was a rebirth of Indian National Army by Subhash Chandra Bose. INA became a fear factor for British as they advanced their strength in the early stages of the war. Arakan Offensive. So Bose initially thought of acquiring arms, but later dropped that plan and decided to gain hold of Indian territories, that is northeastern India and Gangetic Plains. He decided to do it. As Japanese broke the British defense, INA and Azad Hind Fauj too fought hard against this. INA with its guerrilla army fought in the Chittagong Valley or the Irrawaddy Valley. Irrawaddy is the name of the river which now flows in between India and Bangladesh. So basically, what was happening that he had civilians in the INA and Azad Hind Fauj, and British had the British Indian Army. So when Japanese strength waned, it affected the INA as well. Why? Because INA had taken support from the Japanese. INA required support from civilians, and those civilians happened to be Indians. So basically, what happened was that it was the British Indian Army that was fighting the Indians in the Indian National Army. So, Indians fighting against Indians. It withdrew its army while some officers were tried for treason in this case, and they joined Bose on his journey to Singapore. INA suffered due to the lack in arms because the Japanese were retreated back, supply, and manpower, which proved detrimental for its fall, but had a formidable army. Sad to note is that the British Indian troops were fighting their own brothers in the INA for the British. So they were fighting British and they were fighting against their own people for the British. A very sorry state of affairs. So all these pictures come that showcase the formidable spirit of the Indian Army under Subhash Chandra Bose, the INA, which were mostly civilians. Salute to their spirit. Now, what Indians gained and lost in the aftermath of the Second World War? Indians emerged as a formidable power after the war, although they are not recognized, which is why they are the unsung heroes of this entire war. It sealed the place of India in the world history. Many Indians lost their lives and remained as memorials. British provided the ammunition and gave an impetus to construct Indian Army. So Indian Army got all these things. Other than this, taking cue from this, India have always maintained a strong army by keeping apart a huge sum for its improvement. Till now, after pre-independence and after independence, making sure that Indian army has got adequate supplies. In spite of little importance accorded to India's role in the Second World War, history cannot be erased. It means that India's role was there in the Second World War. Indians fought their kin, their own brothers, during the Second World War for survival, and that too for British. The mighty Indian army wasn't only fighting for the British, but for the whole nation to emerge free from the British hold. So it is what they gained and what they lost. Mostly it was the gain that happened during that time. And there were obviously there were things lost. They were fighting their own kin. They were fighting for the British, for someone else. So it became negative for the Indian army. So salute to the spirit of these Javans, the Indian army. Jai Hind.